Welcome back to another episode of the Commander Experience podcast. I am one of your hosts, I'm Brian.
And I'm Jacob. Today we are going to continue on a journey through the colors of Magic. And we next up here in this episode, we are going to talk about the color red.
Let's break it down. Talking about red, I think there's a few obvious utilities or whatever you want to call it that comes to mind. And in my case, that's treasures. For many years, Dockside Extortionist were roaming the realm of Commander and was pretty much the card you saw just before you were losing. That got banned a little over a year ago now. But I still think that treasures are in good hands of the color red.
Definitely. I think it's also pretty healthy that we don't see Dockside. Then some of the other treasure cards can actually get some spotlight. And yeah, they're pretty good, some of them. We're still good at that.
You still see that Magda is a CDH Commander viable choice even without Dockside. So I think that's a testament to treasures being safe for the time being. And there's also so many new cards providing support to treasure-based strategies. So
yeah, and when we talk about treasures, we are kind of talking about tokens as well. And one of the other pros of red is they are pretty decent at making tokens. So far, that hasn't been very relevant in our meta and also in CDH. But in lower brackets, it's definitely one of the better colors at that. And I think that this will be more useful in the future since we see a lot more Gaia's Cradle stuff going on. And creating tokens, if they are good enough of creating enough at some point, then that might be a pretty decent strategy.
Also, I think, like treasures providing mana, it's one of the things that red to some extent are very good at because of all the rituals they have available in their color, providing big bursts of mana when you need it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that we talked about that and talked about some of the other colors as well, that we are more prone these days to use rituals and non-permanent mana because our games has gotten faster. I think we will see more rituals in the future in our pod, and we are seeing more than we did before. And I'm thinking about it more as well.
And also, I think it's safe to say that red is the home of the haste ability. I think red is one of the only colors that really provides haste reliable when you're not talking about lightning greaves or swiftfoot boots or something like that, because of course those are big staples and are usually the way other colors get haste, but red just have that in abundance, I think.
That's one of the things, at least for me, that I have many times looked at. I wanted to do something like tap untap shenanigans or something to that vein, and one of the colors I'm looking for there is, okay, can I get a commander that's red so I can get haste? And I think especially the haste ability is so strong combined with green, with all the mana producing creatures we are seeing now. So red is kind of getting enhanced by green getting better cards as well. It's more important to give stuff haste at this point. So I think that is one of the big things. And also things that's good in red and is seeing a lot of what I think here recently is they are getting better protection, which has been like one of the white things, but red is getting cards that actually does it as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's good to see because you may gain from some of the pros that we talked about. I see them as a pretty good support color, and I think if they got a good suite of protection, they would be one of the best support colors, basically. If they really got them.
I agree.
It's a bit narrow right now. So.
It is. And I also think that when you're talking Spellslinger decks, you usually your mind goes to Izzet colors, and I think that is evidence enough that red is still a very viable color, especially when you're talking that sorts of strategy. They have a lot of cantrip spells, they have a lot of low CMC cards that actually provides value. But I think that it's very specific when we are talking red, because it doesn't provide a whole lot else, if you ask me. It's very good where it's good, and the areas where it's not very good, you don't see the color at all.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it also like reflects, especially when we look back at one of our previous episodes, especially blue, where we talked about what they were good at. Then red is not very good at drawing cards, which we said in that episode is one of the most important things. And on top of that, they are not super good either at ramping, and that might be the two most important things.
Yeah.
In Commander, so that's a pretty rough.
Yeah, and I think even if you look at the good cards in red, it's not like when you look at the good cards in blue or other colors. Other colors tend to have more flexibility, where red is usually very generic. What it does good, but it doesn't offer any other utility or flexibility when it comes to those cards. We talked about Into the Flood more in blue. Like, it could bounce creatures, but it could also bounce non-land permanent if you gifted it. And I know that's sort of the same thing, but we do see other cards where you have option A or option B, or you can both use it like the counter spells. You can both use them offensively, but you can also use them to protect your win cons, where it just seems like red is just much more generic and much more locked in at what it does well, and then that's all you're gonna get.
Yeah, and also just a list of like specific effects. We everyone know that like Ristic Study is a good card, but I can still mention like 20 more cards in blue that draws cards that are pretty decent. Where when I look at red, I can mention 2 cards, and after that I'm like, I wouldn't even put that in my deck if I didn't have a choice. Then I'll probably just look for more colors.
And even if you build mono red, one of the first card drawing spells you will put into the deck is the One Ring anyway. So,
yeah, exactly.
And I think that's a testament to how good the color is at drawing cards. Because red is usually impulse draw, which everyone knows is very bad unless you're playing some sort of RAL, which of course if a CEH commander. But there are these sort of commanders that don't really care if you're running these cards or not that are providing impulse draws. But as a generic card drawing engine, it's just nowhere near good enough.
They need like other cards to activate them. They don't stand on their own.
One of the things that red also struggles with is tutoring, of course. One of the cards we have in our stable category that we're going to talk about in a minute is, of course, Gamble. But I think that is one of the only real cards that provide any sort of tutoring that is acceptable to the standard we have. Even in that case, you can get unlucky and discard the card you're searching for.
Yeah, probably the third most important thing, tutoring, is also a thing they're bad at, so not a good start for red.
Yeah, and we talked about a little bit about that when getting ready to record this episode, that it seems like red is just this color that it does most of the things that the other color does. It just does it a little bit worse. And it's not best in class in any category, maybe unless you're talking rituals and treasures, and even that you can get that in other colors as well. It just seems like all the other colors have this identity where we might not do everything great, but we have this one thing that we does real great, and the other colors can't touch that. And I do think that red lacks a little bit in that identity, if you could say that.
I think that's also why, as I mentioned earlier, that for me at least, it lands squarely in the support color. And most of the time, I don't mind having red, but most of the time it's like 5 cards I just put into the deck, and that's about it. And I don't really look through for some secret cards because there probably isn't any.
Yeah, and I have a few 5-colored decks myself, and to no surprise, when you have access to all 5 colors and you're looking into building your support category for your deck, it mostly contains blue, so you will always have Deflecting Sword somewhere, and if the strategy calls for it, you will have Underworld Breach and cards like that, but maybe Ragavan if you want your commander out fast, cards like that, but it's the list is just very, very narrow when you have access to other colors, I think.
Yeah, I think for me, you basically mentioned, I think I have like 3 cards that are true staples or auto-includes, and you mentioned Deflecting Sword and Underworld Breach. I'm not so sure anymore of Underworld Breach. It's a good combo card. I have not just put it into every deck, but I've kind of stopped doing that. I think it's still pretty decent. And the third card on my list that is like auto-include, at least for now, is Jessica's Will. And for true auto-includes, if I don't look at anything else, that's like the only 3 cards for me at least.
We can talk a little bit more about Jessica as well. I have a few comments to that when we talk about the stables. But yeah, that was a little bit about where we see the colors, a little bit of the pros and cons. And as it sounded like, we of course are considering red to be a support color and not a main color, unless you're choosing to play a mono red commander.
Maybe just to mention, Italy is probably the only one that's kind of choosing red as the main color, even though they have green. So if you want to be spicy, that's one.
Yeah.
But yeah, generally support color, I would say.
But yeah, let's move on to talk a little bit about what are some of the red stables that we see in Bracket 4. And let's just start up with the Jessica as well, because I thought it was interesting when you said that it was one of your auto-includes, because I think that has been one of the issues for me. The facts we just talked about, where if you run multiple colors, you don't have that many red cards. And I've been experiencing more than once that you have Jessica's Will, but no red cards in hand. And now it's like, okay, I'm going to cast Jessica's Will, and maybe I'm doing this to hit my land drop, and then I'm hoping to get something out of the free cards. And that is if you have your commander in play. And I've had these lackluster turns with Jessica's Will, using free mana, getting, let's say, 6 red mana and 3 cards in exiled, where maybe I've played a land for turn, maybe I even played a mana rock, but that was kind of it.
Yeah.
So I paid 3 mana to play a land and a mana rock? I mean, that's not really great value. I mean, I will always do that if I'm gonna miss my land drop, of course. But I do think that the ceiling is high with Jessica's Will. I just think that if you're running multiple colors, that you have a harder time of reaching that ceiling. And Jessica's Will will be used much more on average or below average. But I don't know what your thoughts is regarding that. You're playing a lot more Jessica's Will.
Yeah, probably. I think that for me, just the fact that you can draw, let's do that, 3 cards for 3 mana. If that's just the real bottom of the floor, then for me that's decent if you're in a pinch. So I think just the fact that it can do that basically always good enough for me. And then there is just the sometimes where it's just insane, where someone has been sitting on a heuristic study and had 25 cards in hand, and you make 25 mana and you suddenly win off of Jisk as well. So it definitely have a big range. But it might also be some like personal love for that card, that you can have that dream scenario. But yeah, it might also be something to do with playstyle, because I think maybe I have a tendency to play more colorless cards, or at least mana rocks and stuff like that. So maybe on average I have a higher chance of having cards that cost generic mana. I'm not sure if it's true, but yeah.
Well, as we said, what red really lacks is, of course, ramp. And when you lack ramp in a color, you usually use the rocks. So, of course, Jessica's will help provide you with that mana casting the rocks, meaning that it doesn't really cost you anything to cast Jessica's Will. And that's where it's good. I also think Jessica's Will gets a lot better if you have a commander that has, let's say, 2 or 3 generic mana, because now you can just use it as a ritual, and maybe you don't get the card drawn out, but at least you get your 5 or 6 CMC commander out fast. I do think in those kind of decks, they're slam dunks. But if you're running, let's say, a 2 or 3 CMC commander, and you know that you're never going to use the mana for casting your commander unless it's taxed, of course, it might get a little bit worse, because yes, now maybe you're going to get both modes on Jessica's Will when you're casting it because your commander is out, but now you're in the pinch where you're running 3 colors and maybe you don't have anything to use that mana on. And I do think that is a little bit lackluster, but maybe it's not as big of an issue as I think it is. Maybe it's still just good enough.
Yeah. Come to think of it, I think also actually which is a bit odd, but our commander choices also changes Jessica's Will a lot. I think you have a tendency to have more impactful commanders that are really threatening on the board, or at least not either that or big mana cost ones. Or I have a tendency especially to play partners, and partners has like this hidden mode where if you have one partner, you can Jessica's Will and use that mana to pay for the other partner. So you like guaranteed value in some way. So yeah, definitely also something to do with playstyle, which is pretty interesting. But I think that's the sign of a good card, or at least a well-designed card.
I think talking about it now, I still think I will be a bit stubborn and say I do think that the ceiling is lower than one thing. But talking about it now, I also think that the floor might be a little bit higher than maybe I give it credit to. That the floor is probably just good enough for the mana you're paying for it. And by that extent, now you have all these other situations where you're getting closer to that ceiling, and now it's above average. But let's move on and just talk a little bit about some of the red stables. We're not going to dive into all of them because many of them, as we told you earlier in red, are pretty generic and forthcoming about what they do. Let's talk a little bit about all the rituals. First of I think, and the best one is Simian Spirit Guide. I know it's not a ritual, but it's kind of a ritual.
Yeah.
And we use that a lot to get our commanders out fast, especially if they cost 2 CMC. We can get them out turn 1 with Simian Spirit Guide. And then there's, the Seething Sword, Rite of Flame. There's a lot in red.
Yeah, I think that Simian Spirit Guide is probably the one that's the most generic that I would just put in most decks, and the rest is kind of up to your discretion if you want to. Maybe higher CMC commanders can use the other rituals better, but they are good in some cases, and definitely worth mentioning.
It will always depend for me, at least, on how fast I want to get my commander out and how much it's costing. Yeah. I think one of the examples where I kind of break that rule for myself. Or I don't break it because I actually want the commander out fast, but I tend to only use Simian Spirit Guides in deck where my commander costs 3 CMC or less. But I do have my Coram deck, and he costs 4. But that is a commander that I very much want to get out on turn 2 at the very latest. And for that reason, I'm still running Simian Spirit Guide in that deck.
Yeah, I think a good general rule of thumb on basically all ritual is your commander drawing a lot of cards, then rituals is probably pretty decent because he can replace it immediately. And another card that is not a ritual but kinda the same vein is Ragavan, so a treasure generation, so not permanent ramp. But yeah, everyone know what Ragavan does. He's pretty good. Always nice to have him on turn 1. And there is just times where you hit something lucky on top of your opponent's deck and you get real happy.
Yeah, we've seen more than once now that people swing with it turn 2 and they hit a Soul Ring or a Mystic Remora or something like that. I mean, 9 out of 10 times you're not going to get anything, but there are just some of those turns where you hit the jackpot. And you only play it for the treasure generation anyway, so everything else besides that is just pure gravy. So, yeah, we talked about Jesk as well. Then we have, of course, Deflecting Swords for protection. We have Underworld Breach and Aggravated Assault. Those are...
Yeah, basically win cons.
Yeah, it's the win cons.
I think there's like a cast of these, so you can have dual caster mage, kind of the same vein. Kiki-Jiki combat celebrant, kind of the same vein. So red is actually, we didn't mention that in the pros, but red is pretty decent at having some okay win cons. They are very generic, so not very interesting, but they do win the game, so...
A thing we actually didn't talk about in the pros and cons, which is very true. Now we are talking about win cons, that extra combat is a red thing. And almost like taking an extra turn in some cases, because usually when you're taking extra turns, with Aggravated Assault, you also have the infinite mana, usually. So yeah, you can just win from there. But yeah, extra combat is, of course, a very much a red thing.
Yeah.
And you have generically good value cards like Burgi, God of Storytelling. You have Wheel of Fortune for obvious reasons. And some of the few tutors that you actually get in red is Imperial Recruiter. We see that quite a lot at our table.
Yeah, and he got some more love now that Gaia's Cradle has increased in value. Then suddenly a body tutor is good because it's more mana from your Gaia's Cradle. So... Yeah, and then we have seen some new protection pieces, and one of them that we have seen some as our part is Tibble's Trickery. I don't actually play that card, but we have seen it, and I can understand why it's pretty decent. It has like kind of the pact effect, where if you're going to win, it's always nice to have a counterspell, and sometimes you catch people off when having it in non-blue, and suddenly people thought you weren't a problem because they had that piece in hand, and suddenly you had a counterspell.
I think it's a must-have as soon as you're in non-blue, so if you're playing Gruul or Rectus or anything like that. I think Tibble's Trickery is one of the few cards that provide utility that the colors don't usually provide, and therefore you don't expect them. And that is some of the most powerful thing in Magic, I think, the unexpected. I would always run Tibble's Trickery in the non-blue decks. Talking about the rituals earlier, of course there are cards like Mana Geyser also. Those are usually also cards that help you win the game.
Yeah, in some ways that Spellslinger decks is more prone to all the rituals because you have a tendency to copying and all that, so it also plays into those decks. So. But a brand new card that we would like to mention because we're pretty sure this will be a good card is a Hexing Squelcher. We do see a lot of the white cards that silence, like Silence and Grand Abolisher. And not that Hexing Squelcher does that exactly, but it's kind of in the same vein, and now you can do it in non-white. I think that especially in non-white decks, this will just be and also include, and maybe just in all colors. I'm interested to see because there's a bit of difference from bracket 4 to 5, and I think that might be interesting to see because I think there is maybe more or less, the other way around, less counterspells in our pod than a pure CDH pod. So that might say that there is more spot removal. If that is true or not, that's up to debate. But if that's true, then Hexing Squelcher gets a bit worse because it doesn't really do anything about spot removal, really. I know it's 2 life and all that, but yeah, that's nothing. I'm interested to see what it does in bracket 4.
I still think it's even, let's say we're running 10% less counterspells than CDH, maybe even 15. I still think that this is so good because this actually helps you with being okay with running less counterspells, because now when you're countering something, you can't get countered. So it's like you don't need to have a backup counter spell for protecting the first counter spell.
I think we'll see some shenanigans where someone is trying to like trying to abuse Hexing Squelcher more and play like Vexing Bubble, and they have a Hexing Squelcher in play, so now their counters or their free spells will not be countered. Some of that maybe. You can do that with other cards as well. So I think that's also like an interesting space for this card.
Yeah.
But it can kind of be abused with those effects because there is multiple of them. So
that was some of the red stables for bracket 4 that we see at our table. Of course, there are so many red stables that we don't see at our tables, so keep in mind that we are talking bracket 4, of course. And if we forgot any still for the bracket 4 table, then please let us know in the comments. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the cards that we don't see at our table that are maybe good enough. And the first one here is a little bit of a lie, meaning that we do see it a little bit at our table. And that's Blasphemous Act.
Yeah, we do see that a bit in our pod. I think a lot less though than played in bracket 3, but I think it's one of the better cards. And I have a tendency to forget it. And then I see someone else cast it and I'm like, that was pretty good. I should probably put that in my deck, and then I go home and I forget about it. And next time someone casts it, I have this same thoughts. So the funny thing is that back in the day, there wasn't that many creatures in our pod, so I didn't think the card was that good at that point. Now we see a lot of creatures, but for me at least, most of the time I'm the one with the most creatures now. And I play a lot of red decks, but most of my red decks have a lot of board presence, so most of the time I don't want to have a Blasphemous Act, so that's probably why I haven't really put it into my deck. But it is a good card, and I think if you're playing a heavy Spellslinger deck and you're in red, it's probably pretty decent to do it for 1 mana.
Yeah. Talking about board wipes.
Yeah, exactly. Talking about board wipes. I actually cast this like 1 or 2 game sessions ago, I think. So that's Brotherhood's End. It's an interesting one because it's both a board wipe and artifact removal. It can be at least, and it's a more flexible card. It is 3 mana though, which is a lot on our pot. I have a love-hate relationship with this card, and for me it's like the same category as Vandal Blast. I'm not sure if it's good to destroy people's artifacts, even though it sounds good on paper.
Unlike Vandal Blast, this also hits your own artifacts, and that's the downside, but it's also costing 2 less. And I do kind of think it's funny that you have this card in red that doesn't ramp real well, and now you have to play rocks if you want to ramp, and then provide this card to red as a utility card. But at least it's doing something that we just said that red wasn't really good at, and that's provide utility and flexibility. This is one of those cards that actually does this. I mean, if you're not playing heavy artifact or if you're not playing heavy creature, you can just put it in your decks and play one of the modes. I mean, put it in the deck and says 99% of the time I'm just going to use the deal free damage because I'm playing Spellslinger, I'm not running any creatures, or maybe your commander has 4 toughness or more, and then I think this is a fine board wipe. But then we're back to, are you then both running Blasphemous Act and Brotherhood's End? Is that where we're at now? Or I don't see a world where you're going to do that. I think I would much rather just put in Blasphemous Act then. So now it's the other part or the other mode that you're playing this card for, and I do think that's why we're considering this card for bracket 4, and that's for the artifacts, because we see so much fast mana, we see so many treasures and clue decks, and we have the new Cabbage Merchant and food tokens and Academy Manufacturer, and there's a lot of values to be gotten in bracket 4. So Brotherhood's End is one of those utility card that even if you're gonna destroy 1 or 2 of your own artifacts, it's probably worth it.
Probably, yeah.
But that's the question.
Yeah, no, in my deck, it kind of what you said, but in my deck I use it because I'm just a very creature-heavy deck. So for me, it's not really a utility card. It's kind of only the artifact part that's relevant. And that's what's interesting, because we say that it's versatile, but I think in most decks you will end up only using one side, like 99% of the time, because they're like the opposite end of the scale. So your deck will either go one way or the other. So I think that's also why it maybe is not that well liked. But it is an interesting card, and I hope they go down this road more and try to push this, because I think red needs cards like this.
As we talked about in some of the other colors, the question is always not if it's good enough. Well, that's the first question, of course, is the card good enough? But now it's also a question of what is it replacing? And that's the big question. Moving on to a card that we don't see in our part that I've begun to consider more and more. I've been looking a lot more into Spellslinger and Storm-themed decks recently, and for that reason, Striking Rich is one of those cards that seems obvious for those kind of strategies, and I never considered this, to be honest, and it kinda does the same as both Ragavan and Simian Spirit Guide to some extent. Of course, it doesn't have the same timing of you being able to use it on the turn that you want to get the mana, because you're spending one to get one and you have to wait a turn. But it still helps you get your free CMC commander out turn 2. And yeah, I think if you're running Ragavan, I think there will be cases where Striking Rich is much better than Ragavan, because drawing Ragavan turn 4 or 5 is never going to feel good. And you probably never going to get an attack in. Now I'd much rather just cast the Striking Rich and have access to the treasure next turn maybe, or have a mana open for when I'm passing the turn. So I think there are situations where Striking Rich is actually better fit than Ragavan is. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think so, and I also think that like the mode that some people sometimes forget, that it's probably pretty good in Storm decks and stuff like that, but in 5-color decks, it has like this hidden mode where if you, like Joda, where you want to have Wooburg, it can help you bank up a mana of any color for later. And that alone is pretty powerful in some decks, because especially as power level rises, because you have these turns where this is now you want to win. That's where you need the mana, so you're fine by the turn before creating that 1 mana and keeping it up for going for a win next turn. So I think it's good, and it will get better as well in our part. So.
Yeah, it's definitely a card I'm going to be considering more, and you suggested it to my Joda deck, and even though I'm into this Spellslinger Storm mindset at the moment, where I'm looking at those decks and commanders, I never considered this for Joda, and I am already running Ragavan in that deck, and I could see myself putting Striking Rich into that deck as well.
And talking about some treasure-related stuff, I have tried to use some of these cards recently, and they're like a suite of cards. Professional Facebreaker is the big one that is very well known, and then there's Knuckles, which is the new one group. I know that Magna is known as Commander, but he's actually pretty decent in the 99, I think, as well. Yeah, all these cards provide great value, and after I have tried Knuckles at least, I was pretty impressed. I really want to use more of these cards. They seem a bit slow, and I think when I read the cards, they should be too slow. If they are allowed to get their value, I think they will just take over the game. That's probably where their strength is.
I think I've always, as you said, seen them to be too slow, because like many other cards, these are great to have in your opening hand or ready to cast turn 2 or 3. But I do also think that these cards are running into the case of being too slow when you're drawing them turn 5 or 6. Because now it's like, am I gonna cast Knuckles to get some treasures, or I'm not sure.
No, that's where I will argue a bit for, I don't know, maybe a lot of people disagree, but I actually think that Knuckles is the best one just because it has haste.
I agree.
But yeah, they feel a bit slow.
I was just about to say that if you're running Professional Facebreaker generically, let's say you're not running a treasure-themed deck, but you have enough attacking power to say, I think I'm gonna run Professional Facebreaker just for getting some value out of that. I do think now that Knuckles is the better version of that. And of course there will be situations where you don't have that 4th mana early on to be able to cast him, but it will still be the same, meaning that, okay, now you can cast Professional Facebreaker, but you're not going to be able to attack with it anyway. But of course there are the cases if you're running a low CMC commander or something like that. If you have your commander out and able to swing when you cast Professional Facebreaker, of course there will be situations where it provide the value faster than Knuckles does. But if you have the mana, I will say that Knuckles is better 9 out of 10 times.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in some decks we see at least that Magda is the better card, but it's more situational. But we do see in our deck, in our pot, where we tap our creatures to make mana, and that's becoming more and more popular. And then Magda is just, okay, I may tap Magda to make mana and I also get a treasure on top of that. So yeah, they have their own things, all of them. So, but I think they are maybe a bit underplayed at least. But I hope we see more of them to see if they are good enough.
Then we have another one I've been considering lately due to all the fast mana, and that is Treasure Napper. It's an oldie but goodie. We have actually seen this a little bit at our table, but I have just been considering it more and more due to all the fast mana that we're running. I do think it will run into some of the same issues that we just talked about with Facebreaker and Knuckles, that drawing this turn 4, 5, 6, something like that is a feel bad, I think. And now it has to hit some sort of balance where it's great if you have it in your opening hand, and that's not a guarantee either. So I think it remains to be seen if it's good enough. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I have been thinking about it, and that's why I put it on this list, because I do think there's cases where you play this turn 2 maybe, and now you have free mana available yourself. And if just one or two people have tapped an artifact, you can get these big burst of mana, and in that way it's sort of a repeatable ritual in some way. I'm not sure. I would probably definitely run it if I ran something like mono red, maybe in Rakdos. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I had it in play in my Synagogue deck a couple of PlayStations ago. That was pretty powerful, and that's the first time where I've been allowed to really abuse it. I think I made like 15 mana over 2 turns with it. It was very strong in that, but that's the first time it had ever worked. Most of the time it just sits in my hand. But yeah, when it does the thing, it really does the thing. It's interesting. I think, again, it's one of those cards for me, and I know it is a bad habit at this point, but basically it's like, it's a creature that does something pretty good. And if I'm a Gaia Cradle deck and I play 2 colors, I'll probably put it in because it's a creature that makes Gaia Cradle better. But it is interesting, and I hope to see it more because I think they do have some legs, but it is, can be awkward.
I think you will save it for those decks where you need those huge bursts of mana, and if that's not a thing, maybe not, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, next up we have Reckless Handling, so one of the few tutors in red. And I think this card we should just see more in our pod. It's a tutor for maybe the most important thing, artifacts. I think it gets a bit forgotten, and of course if you play a lot of the other colors, you might not want it. But I know I have at least some decks where I just put it in, even though I also play black and blue, just because, hey, I can find a 1 ring for 2 mana. That's probably good enough. So
yeah, I will say if you're playing non-black, you're probably pretty happy with Reckless Handling. Of course, if you're in white, now you have Enlightened Tutor, but I will say if you're playing Izzet or Gruul or something like that, and we do see those deck at our table, I think Reckless Handling is good enough, because turn 2 it can also just be a Soul Ring or something like that if you need the mana. I do think that we should see it more. Of course, it will still be a little worse than Gamble, because Gamble at least can find you anything, and you still have to discard with Reckless Handling. So are you going to run both is the question, and you might, depending on your strategy. I think that being able to find just a Soul Ring or something like that, or the 1 ring, is probably going to be worth it if you're running, like I said, Izzet or Gruul.
Yeah, probably. I think it gets forgotten sometimes as well, and if you have a graveyard deck, you have a tendency to put Gamble in, and Reckless Handling does kind of the same. I know it's artifacts only, but it can discard a non-artifact from your hand you maybe want in your graveyard, so...
Yeah, and it's kind of fun because, as you know, in my Green Goblin deck, I love Gamble because I don't care if it gets discarded or not. And for in those cases, Reckless Handling is pretty much the same thing, because if I can discard it, then it's just 1 mana like Gamble, but I can find a mana rock, and if I can discard the mana rock, in most cases I can just play that for 0. So now it pays for itself, and maybe it's good enough in that deck. Probably is.
It should be in that deck, yeah. Next up, we have a card that we don't see too much in our pot, but we know is very powerful. That's Flare of Duplication. And we talked a bit about it actually before the episode. And what we was talking about is we don't see Rogue Rag in our meta, because I think we all probably just keep our hands off that, because that might be a step too far. And I think that Rogue Rag is basically close to being the only that can really abuse it. There will be some decks that can, but it's, as we have seen in our list here today, that we don't have too many red creatures on our list, so it's kind of hard to use. That said, I think, as you mentioned, actually you didn't mention this, but I think there is like a world where you want to copy that game-ending spell and really cement your victory. Could be an extra turn or something like that.
We talked about Flare of Malice in the Black episode, and what I like about Flare of Malice, as I also mentioned in that episode, is that you can also sort of just use it as a protection piece. Let's say people are going to remove your commander. Now you can just cast Flare of Malice, sacrifice your commander, and get some value from the Flare of Malice. And I think to some degree you can kind of doing the same with Flare of Duplication. And I'm actually just now talking about it. I'm already thinking about in my Quorum deck that I love casting Incarnation Technique in that deck. So casting Incarnation Technique, hold priority, cast Flare of Duplication, sacrifice my Quorum that is now in the graveyard. Now I get an extra Incarnation Technique and can get Quorum back. Maybe. I'm already pondering put it in that deck. That sounds pretty good.
We do see more and more extra turns in our pod. I think it's pretty interesting that you can have an opponent have an extra turn on the stack. Someone goes to counter that, and then in response, you can take an extra turn. So the original gets countered, but you get the extra turn suddenly, and another opponent used their counter spell to stop that, and suddenly it's your turn after that, and maybe you just win the game off of that.
Yeah, and we already talked about if you're running a deck where you might want to have extra turns, that is good enough. I'm actually just now brainstorming here, and I'm already thinking about maybe in my Yoda deck as well, because if I already have that Wooburg bomb on the stack, maybe I want to sacrifice Yoda to get that extra Emergent Ultimatum, Time Stretch, Eldrazi. I mean, that would probably just mean game over. So maybe also on that deck. I think it has more utility, and I definitely think that it's a card that in many cases could be worth running even if you don't have a Rockwrath commander.
Yeah, also because I have written on the list here Fog effects in general, and it's basically the same thing I wanted to talk about there is it good enough to just play Fog and copy someone's extra turn? I have tried it before and it didn't really work that well, but I think that's a long time ago. Our meta is very different now.
It is.
So I still ponder sometimes if that is good enough. Maybe someone should try it out. I'm not sure. It seemed like it could be good enough.
It maybe could. That was some of the cards that we don't really see in our pod or at our table that are maybe good enough. Somebody's definitely more worth looking into than others. For me, Striking Rich and Flare of Duplication is cards I'm gonna consider be putting into my deck after this episode.
I want to make Fog effects work at some point. I'm not sure if they have a home yet, but I do want to do it.
If somebody can make it work, it's you. Let's move on to talk a little bit about some of the cards that are played at our table, but the other way around, they're maybe not good enough to be running. And the first one on the list is a card we already mentioned, and that is Vandal Blast. And I say it's played at our table and maybe not good enough, but is it actually still played at our table? I think I saw one a few sessions ago, but we see it less and less, and maybe that speaks to itself.
Yeah, probably. I will say, when you read the card and think about, okay, I can pay 5 mana and probably in our pot destroy like 10 to 15 permanents, that just sounded insane, but yeah, it's probably just too slow at this point. Casting a 5 mana spell doesn't need to win the game, but at least needs to lead you to winning the game. And I'm not sure that does that. It's a bit rough.
Yeah, I really think this spell should be instant speed to be considering.
Yeah.
You already have the Nature's Claim in green costing 1 mana. So making a 1 mana Vandal Blast is not really pushing the limits. And I think it's okay spending 5 mana Overload like Cyclonic Rift, where you spend 7 to destroy all artifacts. Because I think the big issue for this in bracket 4, and maybe also to some extent in bracket 3, is that you're spending 5 mana on your own turn. And yes, you're not destroying your own artifacts, but you're still giving your opponents a chance to rebuild before it's your turn again. So you're kind of running into the same issues that you are when I'm talking about not running board wipes in general. And that's the timing of it when you're casting sorcery speed.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think instant speed will probably be played. So it's definitely a timing thing. Next up is an interesting one. I actually put it here, even though I think I might be the one playing it the most. And that's Blood Moon / Magus of the Moon. I don't know. I love this card. I could have put them on pet cards maybe. It would be kind of the same. At this point, I put it in some decks, and I know when I put it in the deck that I shouldn't, because it's just not good enough anymore.
We have a few running these. I've actually run both of them myself. Not Magus of the Moon, but I've run Blood Moon, and we forgot to mention it in the blue episode, but Back to Basics. That does sort of the same as Blood Moon does. I ran both of them in my Izzet deck back in the day. But I think I reached the conclusion that, and we talked about this in our Game Theories episode, about stacks pieces in general. They're kind of a dual-edged sword, or whatever you want to call it, where you're not necessarily hitting the opponents that you need to stop, and maybe they're even benefiting from it because now the opponents that can stop the arch enemy can't do so because they don't have the mana for it. So I think playing Blood Moon, first of all, you have to be really knowledgeable about when to play it, because there will be situations where you have it in hand and you might not should be playing it. But I think that if people are putting it in their deck, they're just going to play it and maybe just give the game away. So I think I'm not running them anymore in my decks. So I don't think they're good enough. I think at most they're only going to be good like 25% of the games.
At this point, I do play Megas the Moon more actually than Blood Moon, just because I have a lot of tutor heavy decks that plays green as well. So, but yeah, I do play in some of those decks because I have a dream about, hey, I can tutor it with my green tutor when it's good for me, and it's just never good for me. So yeah.
Also,
I will probably keep putting them into decks.
Also, I do think they get worse and worse the more powerful you play. You don't see them in CDH, and the reason is that you play so many great mana rocks, all the fast mana rocks that you don't see in lower brackets like Mox Diamond and Chrome Box. So how much are you really hurting your opponents by using 3 of your maybe 4 or 5 mana on your turn and say pass turn? So I think that's my big issue with it. You never know if it's gonna be great. Where if we talk about a card like Collector Oath that we are definitely gonna mention in our green episode, now it's a whole different situation. It's always gonna be good.
Definitely. I should just take it out of the deck, but I'm still in love with that card apparently. So and someday I will learn.
And I put these 2 ones on the list, and they are going to be very controversial. And they probably shouldn't be on this list, but we needed some cards to talk about in this category, so they ended up here because we wanted to have a little conversation about them. And that is Redirect Lightning and Bolt Bend. Redirect Lightning are, of course, a newly printed version of a better version of Bolt Bend. And of course, you can compare them to Deflecting Sword, but I do think that 1 mana you have to pay makes it very different. And also, I think now it's a question of, would you rather run a counterspell if you're in blue? So if you're going to play them, first of all, I think this is only going to go in non-blue decks, because as soon as you have to pay 1 mana, I think we're running Swan Song and An Offer You Can't Refuse and Flusterstorm and cards like that instead. I also think that maybe even if you're in white, I think I would rather run Swords to Plowshare or something like that than Redirect Lightning. I'm not sure. That's a game theory question, I guess. But I do think they're a lot more worse than one think they are. And I would say this. Before Redirect Lightning, we didn't see that many Bolt Bends. We saw some, but we didn't see many. And I think if that was the case, then why Redirect Lightning? Is it just that it's easier to cast because you're not putting Bolt Bend in other decks than decks where your commander can activate it?
I think I have a bit of different take, at least. I have been thinking about maybe that Redirect Lightning is just a better card than Swan Song. Sounds a bit weird.
No, I can see what you mean.
Yeah, it is. It's there's ups and downs, but yeah, it feels so good when Redirect is very good. And of course, it doesn't. I think the thing that hasn't made me make the change is that Ristic Study exists, and Redirect Lightning doesn't stop that. So maybe that's just the end of this discussion. But yeah, Redirecting Lightning does just some crazy things sometimes, and it can protect your win, at least from counterspells and point removal. And sometimes it's just an insane gacha moment where someone in your upkeep, I'm going to remove your commander so you don't get the value. And not only can you stop that, but you also remove their commander in response. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I think Redirect Lightning is very strong. But maybe this is also a testament to that maybe I'm a bit more risk averse than you are. I have a tendency to play cards that have a higher ceiling, a lower floor.
I remember, I think we talked about this when it came out, and of course talked about it being a good card. And I think I said back then that this was definitely going in my Corum deck because it was a non-blue commander. And I've actually ended up taking Redirect Lightning out because what I found out in that deck is because I'm running a Reanimate strategy, I would rather have 1 more Reanimate in my deck instead of a Redirect Lightning. Because yes, Redirect Lightning protecting my commander is pretty much the same as reanimating it afterwards.
Yeah.
But my redirect lightning could not reanimate my old Gnawbone or something like that when I needed it to do so. And by that extent, I just found more use for my reanimate spells in that deck. I would much more have an extra reanimate, because then also if my commander got removed, yes, now I didn't have redirect lightning, but at least I could just reanimate it again and sort of had the same effect of protecting my commander. Of course, I miss up the opportunity to hurt one of my opponents, but I just leaned much more heavily into my own strategy instead, which was reanimation. And so if I can even find cases where I play non-blue and I still don't find it good enough, or at least I find other spells better in those cases, then I start questioning how good is redirect lightning, because as all other commander decks, you usually lean into a theme, and how you're going to protect your strategy or how you're going to play it out differs. And there are definitely decks that will have redirect lightning, but I'm also not running it in my Green Goblin deck. So I don't know. I think it's good. I just think it's one of those cards that ends up being, the 101st, 102nd cards in my deck pool.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I hope they make more effects like this. I think red could be a real color if they made a lot more protection.
Agree.
Interesting.
These kind of cards definitely helps with me making that mono red deck that I have been pondering about making. And I do still think there are decks that definitely wants this card. I think your Bellow deck is one of them. I think there are definitely decks where redirect lightning is just going to be a slam dunk. I'm not saying it's not a good card. I'm just saying that, like every other card, I think it's healthy to think about, is it good in this deck, and not just slam dunk them in because those are stables.
Yeah.
Moving on to our favorite category, and the color being red, there's not a lot of cards in this deck.
Which is interesting, because I think this is the color where I have the strongest feelings for my pet cards.
Yeah.
So
the first one I'm actually only running in my Joda deck at the moment, but I'm pondering if that should continue to be the case, because I actually think it's better than it reads. And as you heard in the Black episode, I'm very fond of its Black counterpart, and this one is Creative Technique with the Demonstrate ability. So for obvious reasons, I'm running this in my Joda deck, because that deck is running a lot of high CMC spells. But 5 mana for casting 2 spells randomly. I mean, even if you hit 2 mana rocks, you're not that devastated. You even have 2 mana now to maybe cast something else. I think this is a pretty decent card. I think the floor is good enough just to run it, and I think the ceiling is pretty high. Of course, if you're running a Storm deck with, I don't know, an average CMC of 1.7 or something like that, you're not going to run this. But in bracket 4, where we have a little bit of a higher CMC, I think this is fine.
I think it's cool, but I have a soft spot for all the Demonstrate cards. I think they really hit the nail with that, with Demonstrate. So I hope they make more of those. But it is interesting, and I think that a lot of decks will have actually a use for this. And if you like to be a little spin the wheel and see what happens, I think this could be cool. And also just, maybe it's just good enough if you have a deck that just have a bit of higher CMC than normal. And it can be abused by a lot of things like top deck manipulation and all that. So I think it's pretty cool.
And I already talked about Corum a lot tonight during this episode, but this is actually one of those decks I consider this for as well, because I'm running a few of those high CMC creatures, Old Gnawbone and Cloth, and I have some stuff in that deck that would be pretty decent to hit. I can even hit my Incarnation Technique with Creative Technique, which could be kind of awesome, just for the flavor of it. But that's just one of the deck where I consider this. Getting a Selvala out, having haste or something like that would just be insane. So
like there is also the dream of Vampiric Tutor or something like that. Vampiric Tutor into this card, so that can just be game winning.
It can.
So there is some pretty cool things with it. I think that people maybe forget it when they make top deck manipulation decks, because it can be pretty abusable there. So if you do that, look at this card and see if it's good enough. Brainstorming an extra turn on top of your deck or something like that is pretty cool with this card. The next card that you have also written is kind of in the same vein, that if you just get to cast it, it's probably pretty good. And something you didn't mention with the Creative Technique is also what this does. So just real quick back to the Creative Technique. Because of the Demonstrate, it's kind of hard to counter it. And the next card here is Call Forth the Tempest, which because of Cascade has kind of the same issue for your opponent. that yes, you can counter one of the things, but it will generate value no matter what.
And you're still gonna wipe the board even if it gets countered because you're casting the spell. And it doesn't care about how many spells you're resolving. It just cares about the CMC of the spells you're casting or other spells that you're casting. So it's still gonna wipe the board even if one of the spells coming out of it is gonna be countered. And I think I would go as far as say that even that this is a fairly new card, it might even be a mono red stable to some degree. I've already put it in both my Joda deck, but it's also in Corum now. And I just arrived here yesterday. I just built a tough deck that is Gruul, and I also put it into that deck. So I think you go as far to say that it's just a mono red stable. It is 8 mana, and that's the reason I'm saying it's definitely a mono red stable, but
yeah, I'll say if you have a red deck and you feel like you generate 8 mana in that deck, I would say just put it in. It will probably be pretty good in that deck.
Yeah, when we talked about board wipes in this episode and earlier, we talked about having a reason to put them in. And in some decks they're good, and in some decks they're not. But if it does this, I mean, that's what a board wipe should do before I'm running them. It's either going to be this or Avatar's Wrath or something like that. Then I'm running them.
Yeah. If it has a board wipe that's one-sided and 2 other upsides on top of that, then
now we're talking.
Maybe it's good enough.
And I think that's kind of funny because it's still going to cost you 8 mana. So,
yeah.
I mean, just make board wipes 8 mana and have them do stuff. Then I'm going to run them. Next up on the list is some of your absolute favorite cards of all time, I think.
Probably one of my favorite cards of all time, and I have bundled them up, so it's Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast. I love these cards, and at this point, I think if it hadn't been for the One Ring, I would probably have just begun to put them into blue decks as well. Maybe cut Swan Song, because we are at a point where blue is so integrated and so heavy in all our decks that I have never found a game where I couldn't use them, and it just feels so good because they both work when it's in play and on the stack. So I really love these cards.
Yeah, as we mentioned in the blue episodes, when we are making a deck, or if you want to build some sort of generic strategy and now we have to find a commander for it, the first thing we're doing is what commanders are there that can do this that are blue.
Yeah, exactly.
And by that extent, Red Elemental and Pyroblast is always probably just going to be worth it running, because at the very least it's removing one of your opponent's commanders.
Exactly. I think it's kind of my wash away, if you can say that. I feel it does kind of the same thing and some more. But there is the games, and you know this, especially when we play our first game where we play low rate and you sit there and there's literally no blue decks and you just look at your hand and like, God damn it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think they're worth it. Just like Carpet of Flowers or something like that. I think it's that powerful. That is that in my book at least.
Yeah, I think the case that it can just remove Ristic Studies is big enough of a reason for running these, or maybe even counter it.
Yeah, exactly. There's just so many blue things at this point. I think some years ago it was actually more narrow. Now you have cards like Displacer Kitten, and there's just so many other blue permanents at this point you want to have on the battlefield that they have even more targets now. That's just not on the stack, so...
You don't really need examples or excuses to run Red Elemental Blast or Pyroblast, because Ristic Study and Commanders is just big enough of a reason to run them.
Yeah.
And also it's a counter spell for a counter spell. So
it is.
you can get involved in counter wars even. And in bracket 4, I think that they do well. And I actually think that Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast, talking about them, they kind of demonstrate my point when talking about Redirect Lightning, because I actually think that Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast is high up on my list than Redirect Lightning. So if we are in blue, now what are we talking? We're talking Deflecting Sword, Fierce Guardianship, and so on and so forth. Now you're way down on the list where you're adding Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast, and now you're telling me that after all of those, now you're also adding Redirect Lightning and Bolt Bend. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying that I think they're ending up 101st, 102nd on my deck list, because you have so many good cards in that category.
Yeah, and that light makes a lot of sense, actually, because I couldn't ever see myself put Redirecting Lightning in before any of these two cards. So Yeah, makes sense.
And I actually have 1 or 2 in Quorum, and I didn't even think about that before now, but I have taken out Redirect Lightning, so
Yeah.
it's definitely lower on my list. But that was all we had to say about the color red. We actually ended up having a little bit more to say about red than we initially thought starting this episode. But as always, we just love talking Magic. So here we are once again. Been taking up way too much of your time and our own. But let's hear about all the red stables, pet cards, and whatever you have that we've forgotten to mention in this episode. Put them in the comments. You can also, as always, come join us on our Discord server and ask questions in general, share your deck building ideas, whatever you have. Come share them with us on Discord, and we have a great conversation about that. Well, until next time, thank you for tuning in.
Thanks for watching.